Hello everyone, I'm Ron Berger, and this is the Astrology News Report, an alternate view of world events as seen through the lens of Vedic Astrology. Today is April 18th, 2020. This is the Special Report segment, where I take a topic or person or situation that is pertinent to world events and do an in-depth astrological analysis. In this special report, I will be analyzing Donald Trump's Vedic astrology chart for predictions for 2020. We start with the Vimshottari Dasha, Vedic astrology's planetary period system. Mr. Trump is currently in a Jupiter major period, which got started just around the time he got elected in November 2016. Jupiter is the planet of increase, prosperity, belief, opportunity, and optimism. By way of its signs, Sagittarius and Pisces, Jupiter is the ruler of the 5th house and 8th house of Mr. Trump's Leo rising chart, thereby activating his 5th house karma for creativity, children, guidance, investment, and good past life credit, along with his 8th house karma for death and regeneration, long-term problems, finances with others, big changes, secret actions, scandal, and humiliation. All of this manifests through Jupiter's position in his 2nd house, the house of personal income, materiality, and family, and speech. So we can see that Jupiter is a mixed bag for Mr. Trump, giving him and his family financial benefits from others and boosting his children, but through some questionable activities, which even bring him scandal and humiliation. Now let's look at his current sub-period. Trump's Saturn sub-period began a year ago in January 2019. It continues until July 2021. In other words, through this year and a good piece of the next. By way of its signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, Saturn rules the 6th and 7th houses of a Leo rising chart. Thus, his Saturn sub-period activates his 6th house of struggle and difficulties, health and disease, enemies and litigation, work and employment. Saturn also activates his 7th house of one-to-one relationships, marriage, business partners, clients, distant places, and the direct opponent. Trump's natal Saturn is placed in the 12th house of endings, loss, expense, subconscious, foreign lands, the masses, hidden actions, and places of confinement, such as prisons and hospitals. Thus, his 7th house partnership karma is manifesting in his house of hidden activities, in other words, partners engaged in nefarious deeds, which may even be in foreign lands. His 6th house disease karma manifests in his house of the subconscious mind, and it's Saturn, the planet of decay. His employment karma winds up in his house of endings. Note that Saturn is closely conjunct Venus, the planet of advice and advisors. Thus, his advisors can turn on him and become enemies, resulting in loss and separation. All of this has been obviously manifesting during the past year and continues in 2020. In Vedic astrology, the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses are designated as Dusthana Houses. They signify some of the more nasty things about human life, like struggle, enemies, disease, chronic problems, death, humiliation, loss, confinement, and so forth. Note that in Trump's chart, his Jupiter major period and his Saturn sub-period together have activated all three of the Dusthana houses of his chart, the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses. This planetary period sequence indicates a rather problematic time in his life because it puts emphasis on all the bad karma sectors all at the same time. Against this backdrop of Trump's current major and sub-period, we now go to the transiting planets during 2020. At the end of January 2020, Saturn entered sidereal Capricorn, which in Mr. Trump's chart is his 6th house. Remember that this sector of his chart is already activated, lit up, because Capricorn is one of Saturn's signs, and he is now in a Saturn sub-period. Now notice that just as slow-moving Saturn enters Capricorn, it is directly opposed to his natal Saturn. Transiting Saturn is the reality check planet. Your natal Saturn is your personal reality. Trump's natal Saturn is already weak due to being at 0 degrees of the sign it's in, so transiting Saturn is going to give him a rough time. Saturn is the planet of rules and regulations. Of course, Trump famously hates any restrictions on his own reality, but note that the 6th house is also the house of solving your problem. In other words, your defense system. Saturn in its own sign will both give him problems and give him the tenacity to combat it. On the other hand, Saturn transiting in the 6th house is the planet of longevity and suffering in the house of illness. Since his 6th house is already turned on by his Saturn sub-period, this Saturn transit is very problematic for his health during 2020. And another thing happens. The Saturn transit will be directly opposing Trump's natal Venus. Amongst its significations, Venus is the planet of appearance and popularity. Saturn is the planet of limitation. So, according to his chart, Trump's popularity will take a hit during 2020. But it's not just Saturn that will be affecting Mr. Trump's 6th house. At the end of March, Mars entered Capricorn. Immediately, Mars was directly opposing Trump's natal Saturn and Venus, just like the Saturn transit did in late January and in February. This time, it's the attack planet, afflicting his personal reality planet, and from the house of enemies. The planet of conflict also hits his natal planet of popularity. Even after giving grief to his natal Saturn and Venus, Mars will still be contributing to his 6th house problems, struggles, and enemies until it leaves Capricorn in early May. It's also the planet of infection and inflammation in his 6th house of health, and it's there with Saturn, planet of long-lasting situations. And that's not all. Besides Saturn and Mars, there's also Pluto, the planet of complete destruction and mass events, inching along in the zodiac, changed signs in late February, leaving Sagittarius and entering Capricorn. Now Pluto is directly opposing Trump's natal Saturn. And then something interesting happens. Just as it lines up exactly opposite his natal Saturn, Pluto becomes stationary at the end of April and slowly begins a retrograde period, eventually moving back into Sagittarius at the end of June. During April and May, While it is more or less stationary, Pluto stays exactly opposite Trump's natal Saturn. That's Pluto, the planet of destruction and large-scale events, giving grief to Mr. Trump's planet of self-reality. Of course, we know what that has turned out to be. It's the coronavirus epidemic and the resulting economic downturn. And there's yet another planet to consider, Jupiter, the planet of optimism and opportunity, truth and wisdom, is also transiting in this same sector of the zodiac. Like Saturn, Mars, and Pluto, Jupiter will also spend time directly opposite Trump's natal Saturn and Venus. So this might be helpful. Jupiter is, after all, the great benefic, and gives assistance to whatever it aspects. But Jupiter is also the planet of law and justice, and the sixth house is litigation. And Jupiter is being influenced by its association with Pluto, which will be in near exact conjunction with Jupiter for 3 months that they are together in the early degrees of Capricorn, and both simultaneously opposing Trump's natal Saturn. This is the planet of law, plus the planet of destruction and mass events, opposing Trump's planet of personal realities. Now let's look at what's going on in a different part of his chart. Starting at the end of March and continuing until the end of July, Venus, the planet of popularity and appearance, is transiting in Taurus, which for Mr. Trump's Leo chart is his 10th house of public activities. The transit of Venus in the 10th house is usually good, especially when it's in its own sign. But for egocentric Leo rising, this transit is just another occasion for grandstanding. Leo, the sign of the king, wants to have the attention on himself. Leo is a natural showman. With Venus transiting in his 10th house, this character trait is turned on to max. And indeed, with his daddy needs love rallies now cancelled, he has taken every opportunity to appear before the cameras for a press briefing, praising himself for his success with the coronavirus epidemic. But in mid-May, Venus goes retrograde. That's the planet of love, going backwards, which makes everyone reconsider their romance, or in this case, reconsider their devotion to the leader. Notice that nearly simultaneous with the Venus retrograde period during May and June, Mars, planet of action, force, and conflict, will be transiting through Aquarius, which puts it in the 7th house of Mr. Trump's chart. Mars juices up the energy of whatever house it transits through. The 7th house is the house of one-on-one relationships, famously marriage, but also the direct opponent. As soon as Mars enters Aquarius, it is directly opposing Mr. Trump's natal Mars. This Mars-Mars opposition is highly confrontational and will definitely send the Donald into a frenzy. After that, Mars continues through Aquarius, still adding energy to his opponent, and then, on June 18th, Mars enters Pisces, Trump's 8th house. The 8th is one of the Dusthana houses, and as mentioned earlier, this sector is already lit up and blinking because it's one of Jupiter's signs and Trump is in a Jupiter major period. Mars transiting through the 8th house is generally problematic. The 8th is the house of big changes and chronic problems, including chronic health issues. Mars is the planet of infections, accidents, and surgery. This is also the house of secrets, scandal, and humiliation, so there could be more events for him in that area as well. And now let's take a look at what is happening in the lead up to the election. Saturn begins its retrograde period in early May. Saturn will then slowly back up in Capricorn and once again be directly opposing Trump's natal 12th house planets from August through October. Then, after completing its retrograde period, which will be at the end of September, Saturn will again be at 2 degrees Capricorn on the day of the election. In other words, the planet of restriction will again exactly oppose his natal Venus, and thus be putting limitations on his planet of popularity. By the way, the 12th house, where his natal Venus is located, is the house of the masses. Having natal Venus in your 12th house makes you popular with the masses. But the opposition of transiting Saturn will change that. In September, Mars goes retrograde, and during October, retrograde Mars will be transiting again in Pisces, Trump's 8th house. Mars is a natural malefic planet, and a retrograde natural malefic is especially nasty, even more so in one of the so-called bad houses. And remember, Trump's 8th house of chronic problems, secret activities, scandal, and humiliation is activated because he is in a Jupiter major period. So, this is not good. Note, too, that just before the election, retrograde Mars will be directly opposing his natal Jupiter, planet of belief, truth, justice, optimism, and again, it's his current major period ruler, therefore a doubly significant negative transit. And another thing happens in the lead up to the election. The moon's nodes, the eclipse points, called Rahu and Ketu in Vedic astrology, change signs. In the 3rd week of September, Rahu moves from Gemini to Taurus. Ketu moves from Sagittarius to Scorpio. As it happens, Mr. Trump has a bunch of key planets at the very end of Taurus and Scorpio, which will become afflicted by this new transit. Rahu will be conjunct his natal Sun, his natal Rahu, and his natal Uranus in his 10th house. Ketu will be conjunct his natal Moon and natal Ketu in his 4th house. The nodes coming back to their natal positions happens every 19 years or so. It's considered to be the beginning of a new cycle of the dispensation of one's karma. In other words, a time of transformation, a new beginning. The question is, if he is already President of the United States, what new beginning could this be signifying? Rahu transiting into the 8th house indicates a big focus on reputation and success, and a transformation of one's status and position. Ketu transiting in the 4th house is the planet of dissolution, sacrifice, and surrender in the house of home, in other words, where you live. Often it manifests as changing one's home. Well, he's in the White House, so he has to change where he lives? Oh. Rahu conjunct natal Sun is considered to be an ambitious, ego-enhancing combination with a tendency to go overboard on things. Ketu conjunct natal Moon is considered to be quite negative, an indication of someone taking advantage of you. Rahu conjunct natal Uranus indicates extreme defiance. Both Rahu and Ketu are eclipse points, therefore their conjunction with natal Sun and natal Moon, in this case happening simultaneously, is an indication of some sort of big change. Now, if that wasn't enough, on December 14th, 2020, there will be a total eclipse of the Sun. This eclipse will be at 28 degrees in sidereal Scorpio. that puts the eclipse exactly on Mr. Trump's natal moon. When a total eclipse falls exactly on a key natal planet, it indicates that a not-so-good big change is coming for you, and soon. Okay, so you want me to tell you whether he will be re-elected? From all of this analysis, it appears that Mr. Trump is in for a really rough time in 2020. The parts of his chart that are activated by the planetary period and sub-period, along with a whole sequence of unusually negative transits, makes it hard to see how he could succeed in his bid for re-election. But ultimately, what matters is how his chart matches up with his Democratic opponent. At this point in the process, it seems obvious that his opponent will be Joe Biden. So, in the near future, I will be doing a special report on the matchup between the two charts. So, until then.